Okay, let's just dive right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer. Now, if you've been following the news over the past year or so, you've definitely seen the heartbreaking, just devastating images coming out of Manipur, India. But the source material we are unpacking today, well, it presents a bold, deeply investigative thesis that completely flips the script on what we think we know. It's asking us to look right past the daily headlines and consider a massive, hidden, underlying cause for all this unrest. So I want to pose this question directly to you right off the bat. Is this really just an ethnic conflict? Because, when you're scrolling through social media or watching mainstream news, the narrative is almost 100% focused on a clash between communities. But what if that surface level story is actually obscuring a much darker, much more complex reality? Well, the investigative analysis we're looking at today argues exactly that. Now, before we uncover that hidden layer, we absolutely have to acknowledge the devastating scale of this tragedy as reported by our source. Since May 2023, over 260 people have tragically lost their lives. More than 70,000 citizens have been displaced from their own homes. We're talking roughly 5,000 houses reduced to ashes, and authorities have recovered over 60,000 weapons. The sheer magnitude of this destruction really begs the question, could a simple, localized community dispute organically escalate to this level of heavily armed warfare? And this right here perfectly illustrates the massive gap between what we're being told and what investigators are actually uncovering. The mainstream narrative labels this strictly as a Métis versus Kuki-Zo ethnic conflict. But the source material makes a pretty shocking claim. It says this is not primarily a war over religion or identity. Rather, it is allegedly India's deadliest trillion-dollar resource war, a hidden, high-stakes rivalry over the immense wealth buried deep beneath the very ground these communities live on. Section 1. The Hydrocarbon Jackpot. So, the investigation points to massive underground wealth located directly beneath the conflict zones. According to geological surveys highlighted in the source, the unexplored reserves of oil and natural gas in Manipur's Assam-Arakan Basin could be around 5 trillion cubic feet. I mean, 5 trillion. This isn't just a minor discovery. This is a monumental, absolute game-changing cache of energy resources. To really grasp the scale of this, let's put it into perspective. India's total annual natural gas consumption is roughly 2.3 trillion cubic feet, right? So the estimated 5 trillion cubic feet sitting beneath Manipur means that, theoretically, this single region could fulfill the entire country's requirements for years. The analysis argues that this is a jackpot so unbelievably massive that major corporate players would go to extreme lengths to secure access to it. So how long has this been brewing? Because geopolitics tells us that these massive resource races, they don't just happen overnight. The timeline presented in the source actually traces back to the year 2010, which is when the government granted a company named Jubilant Energy exclusive rights for oil exploration. And we're talking about a small patch of dirt here. These blocks covered almost 4,000 square kilometers. But here is where the friction really begins. The report highlights an investigation by Land Conflict Watch, which claims that the indigenous tribal communities living on those 4,000 square kilometers were kept completely in the dark. Locals reported they were never properly notified about the oil drilling. They alleged they literally only found out when heavy machinery and survey teams suddenly rolled onto their ancestral lands, completely bypassing transparent community consent and relying on these backroom non-objection certificates. Section 2, the rare earth mineral race. Because if you thought this was just about oil and gas, well, there is a second, even more critical layer. The eastern belt of Manipur, specifically along the Indo-Myanmar border, is part of a geological complex known as the Indo-Myanmar Ophiolite Belt. And guys, it is an absolute gold mine for the 21st century global economy. It holds critical elements like chromite, nickel, copper, cobalt, and platinum group elements. These are the exact crucial materials required for electric vehicle batteries, semiconductors, solar infrastructure, and modern defense equipment. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is how this local geography directly connects to the massive global race for clean energy. The source cites projections from the International Energy Agency indicating that global demand for copper and nickel is going to absolutely skyrocket, growing by over 200% by the year 2040. This surging demand has suddenly turned Manipur into a highly lucrative hotspot on the world mineral map. It is quite literally a global resource race playing out right under the surface of this localized conflict. And the moves to secure these minerals? They were already well underway. The data reveals a pretty shocking detail from independent researchers. At least 39 memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, for mining and extraction projects were officially signed. And crucially, these were signed directly in the tribal hill areas, allegedly without the proper consent of the indigenous populations who have lived there for centuries. And the corporate footprint doesn't even stop at mining. Official government documents show that over 66,000 hectares in the hill districts were reserved for corporate oil palm cultivation under the National Mission on Edible Oils. Environmental experts featured in the source material are raising huge red flags here. They warn that this could lead to severe deforestation, the drying up of ancient water bodies, and ultimately the forced displacement of local communities from their lands just to satisfy commercial interests. Section 3, the 2023 tipping point. Okay, so let's summarize what we have so far. We have a powder keg of vast natural resources, massive corporate interests, and deeply anxious local populations. To understand the trigger that set it all off, we absolutely must look at Manipur's unique land laws. It's like a giant puzzle. The state's geography is fundamentally split. About 90% of Manipur's land is made up of protected hill areas, while the remaining 10% is the valley. It is within that massive 90% protected hill territory that this alleged trillion-dollar ecosystem of oil, gas, and rare earth minerals is actually buried. Now, layer the demographics right onto that geography. The majority Métis community makes up roughly 53% of the state's population. However, they are predominantly confined to that tiny 10% valley area. Under the current laws, non-tribals, which includes the valley-dwelling Métis, are legally prohibited from purchasing land in the 90% protected hill areas. That legal boundary is essentially a fortress. It's a legal wall protecting the resource-rich hills from commercial land acquisition. So what actually changed? The analysis draws a direct, undeniable chronological link here. In April 2023, the Manipur High Court issued an order instructing the state government to consider granting Scheduled Tribe, or ST, status to the majority Métis community. Almost immediately following this instruction in May 2023, massive and tragic violence broke out across the state. The timing, according to the source, is no coincidence. And here is the core of the tension, as reported by our source. The Hill tribes, they didn't view the demand for ST status merely as a social justice or identity issue, not at all. They perceived it as a legal backdoor. They feared that if the Métis gained ST status, that protective legal boundary we just talked about would completely shatter. In their eyes, it would pave the way for politicians and massive extraction corporations to use valley communities as a proxy to legally buy up their ancestral, resource-rich lands. Section 4. A global pattern? Let's zoom out for a second because the source material makes an incredibly compelling argument that what is happening in Manipur is not an isolated incident. As the research explains, native populations living in areas that are incredibly resource-rich but economically underdeveloped are frequently targeted. We've seen this exact playbook play out in parts of Africa and Latin America, where indigenous people are ruthlessly displaced, often with government and corporate backing, simply to gain control over the incredibly valuable land they inhabit. The analysis argues Manipur is tragically just becoming the latest example of this global trend. Which brings us to the core, urgent warning of this entire investigation. While mainstream voices might completely suppress this angle, the independent data suggests that the heartbreaking violence we see on the surface, the burned villages, the displaced families, the strictly ethnic framing, is actually a tragic smokescreen. The real conflict, the real prize, is running below the ground. It's a deeply buried war for massive economic acquisition. Which leaves us with a heavy, deeply provocative thought to chew on. As the world races toward a clean, green energy future, building more EVs, more semiconductors, and advanced technologies, we really have to ask ourselves, what is the true human cost of our global clean energy transition? Are vulnerable communities paying the ultimate price for the minerals beneath their feet? It's a fascinating, if incredibly unsettling perspective that entirely changes how we view these global conflicts. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the narratives you see and to always keep digging deeper.